Lords International Agreements Committee. And we're particularly this afternoon going to hear evidence in relation to the UK accession to the US-Bahrain Comprehensive Security Integration and Prosperity Agreement, CSIPA, and it's two oral evidence sessions that we're going to have. So I welcome people to this session. We've got witnesses for this session, two of whom are on screen, and one of whom is with us live, and we welcome all three of you. I'm going to ask members of the committee, as is usual, to declare interests when they first ask a question. And with that, I will start and really ask for a general overview of the agreement, including the context and background to the original negotiations. So can I ask you, please, Ms. Dent, Dr. Al-Hassan and Dr. Roberts, please, to deal with that in any order that you want. Who would like to start?
Oddle, please.
Dr. Roberts, please.
I was meeting my good friend, but no problem, of course. So, of course, this is the latest agreement in a series in many ways that goes back a very long time. The UK has been, of course, engaged in the Gulf for many, many years, many, many decades, and so this is, I guess, the latest component of that. This specific agreement, I'll defer to my American colleague on the evolution from the US side. But we are the latest country, or the only country after the original instigators, to look to join it. I think it fits nicely into sort of the evolution of kind of the British kind of approach to the Gulf, if you will. It's not out of step in any way, shape or form. It's more of the same. It's trying to sort of institutionalize our approach. And I don't see our approach changing anytime soon. I haven't seen anything to the contrary of that. And so it fits quite nicely into that approach, if you will. One other thing I would say is that an interesting component of this is in the word sort of the institutionalization. Some of the latest research, I think, looking at successful security agreements, I'm thinking of Dr. Bent Nemeth and other colleagues, they focus not just on the big and kind of glitzy security agreements, but they find, or the latest research I think finds, that it's these sort of mini-lateral agreements among a couple of states where there is some meaningful kind of progress made that helps kind of glue larger alliances together. And thinking of the sort of specific elements which are quite useful, there's a defence working group that should be established, it's said, and that strikes me as a specific thing that might be relevant. Standards and guidelines, best practices, it stipulates meetings per year, and so it's more on the pragmatic end of things.
Thank you very much. Ms. Dent, would you like to add anything to that? And then I'll come to Dr. Al-Hassan.
Sure, thank you. I'll just provide an overview from the U.S. perspective. It is a binding international agreement. It was signed between the United States and Bahrain in September of 2023. It was intended to grow to include countries that share this common vision, based off of deterrence, diplomacy, economic integration and growth, security integration, de-escalation of conflicts. A large part of this grew out of the fact that the region saw the United States in particular as disengaging. So several countries have been attempting to negotiate mutual defense treaties or other strategic framework agreements with the United States. This is the first one that we've really made progress on. And so we believe that the U.S. and Bahrain CSIPA, which I'm going to call it from here on out since it's such a long name, can help lead to a more prosperous, integrated, peaceful, and stable Middle East without being predicated upon a large U.S. force presence in the region. I think you all have the background of the three pillars of the agreement, so I won't go too deep into that, but it is the first agreement of its kind to promote this cooperation and blend the traditional security cooperation with areas that are likely to become the backbone of security cooperation in the field, like technology cooperation, economic integration.
Thank you. Dr. Al-Hassan, if I can turn to you, but particularly, can I ask you to tell us what you think the benefits to the existing parties of the UK's accession to this agreement will be?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be invited to address you today. The CCIPA, I think it's important to recall, represents a formalized and enhanced U.S. commitment to the security and prosperity of Bahrain. From the US's standpoint, it's meant to demonstrate the US's enduring commitment to the region. And the demonstration of such commitment, I think, takes on added geopolitical significance because of the Middle East's worsening security environment, growing Chinese influence in the region, the growing risk of Iran's possessing a nuclear weapon, and so on. From the Bahraini standpoint, the agreement reinforces deterrence vis-a-vis Iran, and it facilitates Bahrain's priority access to US weapons and technology. Earlier in 2024, Bahrain became the first Gulf state to receive deliveries of the US F-16 Block 70 fighter aircrafts. And that's been linked to, in part, to the CCIPA signing. From the UK standpoint, or at least as far as the UK's accession to this agreement and what it brings by way of benefits to the existing parties, I think in a sense it provides a framework. It provides a framework for pre-existing cooperation in the defense domain between the UK, Bahrain, and the US. So let's recall that Bahrain hosts the UK Maritime Component Command, UK MCC, at HMS Jufair. This is the UK's first naval base east of Suez since British withdrawal in 1971. But Bahrain also hosts the US Naval Forces Central Command, US NAVCENT, and the US Fifth Fleet. The UK and the US are also leading members of the Bahrain-based Combined Maritime Forces. This is a coalition of 46 states which conduct counter-piracy and interdiction operations in the southwestern Indian Ocean. Bahrain, the US, and the UK, among others, are members of Operation Prosperity Guardian in the Red Sea and Operation Poseidon Archer against the Houthi movement in Yemen. And I think the UK's accession to this agreement would probably also reinforce the collective message of deterrence vis-a-vis Iran, which is a shared security threat and adversary for all three signatories of this agreement. So I think the UK's accession would provide a framework for much of this pre-existing defense and security cooperation.
So you're saying there are opportunities for the UK, or indeed more generally for the world, by the UK joining the agreement to add to the overall commitment. Are there risks for the UK, in your opinion? I'll ask Dr. Roberts the same question in a moment. Are there risks for the UK in acceding to this agreement?
There are. So, in a manner of speaking, there are always risks to any agreement, to state the obvious. I think the risk probably on the minds of most would be the risk of entanglement. What if the UK's enhanced security commitment to Bahrain leads to a risk of entanglement in regional conflicts? Now, I think it's important to remember that this risk runs both ways. And as a matter of fact, the Bahrain has joined US and UK efforts to counter Houthi aggression against US and UK interests in the Red Sea, rather than the other way around. And so in a sense, this is a risk that runs for all parties in an enhanced security commitment. Let's keep in mind that the US could invoke, and the UK could invoke CCIPA to encourage Bahrain to facilitate and provide logistical support for a US or UK response to a threat emanating from Iran or its armed non-state partners in the region. And I think it's important not to take such support in the Gulf for granted. Over the past few years, Iran-backed militias in Iraq have conducted hundreds of attacks against US bases and personnel in Iraq and Syria. And yet, over the past year, multiple Gulf states have reportedly denied the US permission to use their airspaces and territories to launch strikes against Iran. And so I think there is a benefit in ensuring that the US and the UK are more likely to receive logistical support from Bahrain in case they needed to respond to threats emanating from the region to their own security. But of course, that carries with it a theoretical, but I think risk that in the event that Bahrain were to be subjected to an attack from Iran or from its armed non-state partners, that the UK and the US would be called upon to provide assistance. I think this is an expectation in any case because of the UK's and the US's long-standing defense and security partnerships in Bahrain, their military presence in Bahrain. This is an expectation that would have predated CCPA in any case.
We'll want to ask a little bit later about the particular commitment. I was just looking to see the clause that it's in. I mean, at Article 2, sort of mutual defence and security in the event of external aggression. We will look at that in a moment in a little bit more detail. But thank you for that. Dr. Roberts, do you want to add to this? I'm still looking at the opportunities and risks for the UK.
I would just emphasise again the point that I think this is as an incremental escalation in UK involvement, not a fundamental step change. So the defence cooperation agreements, as far as I know, are closed source, so I don't know the ins and outs of them. So I suspect we are already, to some degree, committed, involved, engaged, as it were. And I don't see a huge amount within this that qualitatively changes that, makes it more risky, as it were. We'll come to the wording perhaps a bit later on. But
you're referring to the existing agreement, which is actually not public.
The variety of existing agreements. We've been operating in the region for obviously a very long time. I'm sure there's an array of sort of UK bilateral and multilateral agreements already within the region, and this doesn't seem out of step with those, is my point.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn to Lord Dudley Lister, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is really a question to everybody. How does this agreement fit into the wider regional security picture? And how likely is it that it is to fulfil the aims of achieving greater regional integration and cooperation on security matters?
I'm happy to offer an initial thought,
yes,
if I may.
Yes, please do.
Thank you. So just to set a little bit of kind of context here, I don't think that our friends in the Gulf have been enormously serious about forging military commitment in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s. It wasn't an entirely serious endeavour, would be the critique I would offer. I think that there was a belief that the enormous preponderance of US military forces and military bases in the region gave de facto a certain amount of deterrence and or protection from threats within the region. And so the military endeavour, it went on, a lot of money was spent on it, but again, I'm not sure whether there was an entirely coherent linking of ends, ways and means to forge efficient military kind of militaries ultimately. I think that's been changing a lot in recent years, that state of affairs, I would argue. In particular, on the 14th of September 2019, there was an enormous attack on Saudi Arabia's most significant oil exporting facility, Abqaiq, and another one on Khurais. This was Iranian proxies, I think, is the conclusion. Missiles and drones. They struck the world's most important refining facility with unbelievable accuracy. The satellite photos, you see pinpricks on a lot of the infrastructure. And I think that broke any illusions that leaders in the Gulf might have had that they enjoyed some kind of miraculous protection from the US or anybody else. This was, one of the most important critical national infrastructure sites in the world, in many ways, certainly in Saudi Arabia. And, American deterrence didn't deter, American military might didn't protect. And President Trump, didn't really do much in reaction. So I often see Abqaiq as a pivotal moment of inflection where a slightly unserious approach to defence until that moment when I feel that, the potential of what could happen kind of transpired. And so I say that because I see this agreement as more of a nuts and bolts institutionalizing approach to meaningfully help to forge more military capability in the region and regional kind of integration. So I think that's where it's sitting, if you will. I think it's pushing nicely towards that aim. But the specific question of will this succeed or will this lead to to greater military capability in the region, it's an imponderable. It's very difficult to do, especially we'll come on to, I suspect, more multilateral components of this about whether other Gulf nations might join.
Yeah, we'll do
and
that,
that gets tricky. It very much does.
Ms. Dent, do you want to add anything to what's been said on this sort of general topic about opportunities and risks?
I'll just briefly add that the agreement is largely complementary of a lot of the ongoing U.S.-led efforts to integrate a lot of the regional security architecture. Bahrain has been a leader in that sector, and so I think it made sense for the U.S. to pursue Bahrain as the first signatory of this agreement. But it's largely a formalization of those initiatives, as my colleagues have said, and it both recognizes Bahrain as a leader in these endeavors while also accelerating ongoing efforts to integrate regional integrated air and missile defense and maritime security to establish a common operating picture. But it also helps us identify new areas of cooperation and integration in this arena, and it broadens the scope of regional security to mean both economic and technological integration as well. So it's a much broader specter of regional security integration.
Thank you. I want to thank Lord Udney Lister for his question, but take the opportunity in doing so of thanking him for his service to this committee, because this is the last formal meeting, sadly, that he will be attending. The same, I'm afraid, goes for Lord Grimstone and Lord Etherton as well, and I want to renew thanks to them. Maybe it won't be long before they come back. I don't understand how these things are resolved, but thank you very much indeed. Can I move then to the next question, if I can? Lord Hannay, please.
Yes. First, declaration of interest. I was head of the Foreign Commonwealth Office's Middle East Department in the late 1970s. I want to turn to the aspect of this agreement being open to others to join. Well, the meeting we're holding today obviously establishes that rather clearly, because Britain is going to join, and we are being asked to assess that decision. But which countries in the region do you think might possibly be candidates for joining this process? Has any of them shown any interest in it? And to what extent do some fairly well suppressed but existing rivalries and disagreements between various Gulf countries stand in the way of joining this agreement? And so could you say something on that? And perhaps, Elizabeth Dent, when you come to comment, you could tell us something about what the new US administration's attitude towards this sort of agreement is likely to be. It does look like a kind of multilateral agreement which doesn't inspire the new president very much, to put it politely. And will they back this? Will they back its extension to other countries?
I can go first then, if that's helpful. I won't get out ahead of any of the government-to-government conversations, but I think logically, countries who are also participating in some of the regional integration efforts make the most sense to pursue as we seek to expand this agreement. So the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, when the time is right. Israel, I don't think it's quite ripe yet. But then there's also a secondary group of countries that have interest in the region and who have a stake in ensuring that the region is prosperous and stable. So I'm thinking Japan, South Korea, other European countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. All of those countries would make sense for expansion. But it probably makes the most sense at this current time to continue pursuing more of the regional partners. Again, in terms of some of the GCC intra-conflict, I think we're facing a pretty drastically changed security environment post-October 7th. And I don't think that these tensions have subsided by any means, but they are certainly more muted in the face of other issues going on. National security has broadened to be more than just defense and military cooperation, as I mentioned previously. And I think it's in the best interests of many of the GCC states to pursue this greater economic integration and technological integration, because it creates a common set of standards and can help with economic development for all of the countries involved. I will say that the only spoiler would be the potential US-Saudi Mutual Defense Treaty, which is premised on normalization with Israel. If it were ratified by the US Senate, That would obviously be a much stronger mutual defense commitment from the United States and could potentially deter countries from wanting to join the CEPA if that were to pass, because they would then realize that a much stronger U.S. commitment would be on the table. In terms of the new U.S. administration, I will not purport to know what President Trump may do with this agreement, but I do think that it is in line with his previous term in terms of pursuing transactional diplomatic initiatives that can help both grow the American economy and also ensure better bilateral strategic cooperation with countries that we have shared interests with. So I do actually think it is in line with his worldview, despite the bilateral and multilateral nature of the agreement.
Lord Fox, he wants to come in.
Well, it's really how set in stone is this agreement, or is there scope to flex it in order, if you're looking to negotiate with other people to join it, or is it what it is and it stays what it is, and you either like it or lump it if you're a potential new entrant? And I should say I have no interest to declare. So maybe Elizabeth, maybe you might have the answer to that.
Sure. So I'm not exactly sure from the Bahraini perspective, but from the U.S. perspective, it is an executive agreement, even though it is internationally binding. An executive agreement means that it was signed under the Biden administration. The Trump administration is at liberty to either continue to carry it out or to say that they're not going to. Given that it is an executive agreement and has not been ratified by our Senate, I do believe that it would be able to be amended if all parties who have signed on to the current text were to agree on amendments. But my colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong.
Just if I may, I hadn't appreciated that. So, assuming it's amended in that way, would the UK, if it succeeded, need to agree to that, or would it just sort of have to be carried along in the slipstream of the exchange?
I believe that any party who had signed on to the agreement would need to agree on any language change.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, forgive me. Lord Grimstone, I think, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I should declare an interest that I'm a member of the Bahrain's Economic Development Board's International Advisory Board. I'm going to abuse my position, Chairman, by asking two questions, if I may, as this is my last meeting attending the committee. The first question, which very much follows on what we've discussed already, is there is, of course, a lot of mutual activity in regard to defending shipping lanes in the region at the moment, and a lot of very strong international cooperation. Do you think this agreement in itself strengthens or changes in any way those international agreements on the keeping shipping lanes open?
I can't see how this would interfere with that. It strikes me as complementary. Of course, in terms of the Naval Command in Bahrain, it's led by an American in the Royal Navy, the deputy positions, and so therefore, I think we're quite well placed to sort of borrow from one to the other to have this agreement augment existing capabilities. So I don't see any reason why this would be an obvious concern or duplicating. Elements of the Maritime Task Force 154 is to do with maritime security training. So there's already plenty of training that's going on within the region. And, I would imagine that the UK, that might be something that we would like to pursue. Our fundamental sort of approach to foreign policy and defence, of course, is enduringly multilateral. We can't do anything unilaterally. Everything absolutely has to be multilateral with as many partners as we can, which is why, going back to my first point, this fits into the thrust of kind of UK foreign policy so nicely, I think. But that would strike me as an element whereby, something that we could and should be pushing in the region to have one augment the other.
My second question, Chairman, is that we have focused so far in this session on the defence aspects of this agreement. And indeed, most of the public commentary on this agreement does focus on the defence aspects on it. This is a three-pillar agreement, and in particular, there are purportedly strong commitments on investment and trade for the three countries to cooperate together with each other. Do our witnesses have any thoughts or insights as to how useful those other pillars are. The defence pillar is very specific. You can see how it works. It's not at all clear how the investment or trade aspects of this work. Bahrain, of course, has an existing free trade agreement with the US. And we have at the moment neither an agreement with Bahrain, although that may change, of course, nor with the US. And on investment, it's not easy to see why there would be trilateral investment between the three countries. So I'd be very interested in any comments our witnesses have on that.
Who would like to approach that? Dr. Roberts, you want to start?
Just offer a brief initial thought, perhaps, and then over to maybe Dr. Al-Hassan.
Yes.
I have the same opinion as your good self, I think, when it comes to the other pillars that seem to be a little more aspirational, a little less clear, a little less specific. There is, Article 4, Number 2, or Section 2,
yes,
speaks about developing standards, guidelines and best practices, which is welcome in its specificity. But as to the implementation of that, I'm unsure. So I'm a bit more sceptical when it comes to the other pillars, as to how they might meaningfully develop. But I'm very happy to be corrected.
Well, let's ask Dr. Al-Hassan, and I apologise, Dr. Al-Hassan. The sunlight, well, not really sunlight, but the light streaming into this room has obscured the fact that you've got your electronic hand up, so please forgive me for that. But anyway, what can you add for that, for our benefit, please?
No problem at all. Thank you very much, sir. So I think it's important to remember that, politically speaking at least, the UK's accession would complement probably and be perceived positively in parallel with other efforts, such as the ongoing negotiation of a UK GCC, that's the Gulf Cooperation Council, which includes Bahrain as a member state, free trade agreement. And so in a sense, the agreement would be seen as the strengthening of the UK's or a sign of the strengthening of the UK's relationship with one of the GCC founding member states. And now, I admit that the US and Bahrain have yet to articulate very, very clearly how the agreement would materialize in the economic and technological domains. We've seen one announcement in December 2024 by the United States to essentially launch a geospatial acceleration initiative that would facilitate Bahrain's access to US hydrographic, aeronautical, and topographic geospatial foundation data. And so in a sense, I think we're now seeing some US effort to essentially give substance in the technological domain to CCPA. I think when we remember that technology and trade are becoming increasingly securitized, it becomes not so strange, or at least we get a better understanding perhaps of why it might make some sense to include technology and economic cooperation in what is overwhelmingly and largely a security agreement. And so to give you one example, the essentially intertwined nature of geopolitics, technology, and trade mean that there is potentially a case to be made. And so this, I think, has yet to materialize fully. We've seen, for example, that Bahrain was not included in a list of 18 predominantly Western allies and partners that are exempted in the United States from restrictions applying to the sale of advanced US semiconductors or chips. And so this is not a blanket preference for Bahrain when it comes to sensitive areas of US technology that the US wants to protect from Chinese competition. But I think the work that needs to be done here, and perhaps the UK could demonstrate a degree of leadership, is how this agreement could be translated into a framework for enhancing cooperation in areas of technology and exchange that have become particularly securitized and intertwined with global geopolitical competition, AI, semiconductors being perhaps a prominent example.
Do you mean in the GCC area, or are you talking more widely than that?
So in the sense that the agreement could provide a framework for countries like Bahrain and eventually the UK to gain some priority access to areas of US technology that are under export controls that are under added restrictions on inward foreign investment into the United States, which is broadly reflective of a U.S. effort to protect these sensitive areas of technology, the so-called small yard, high fence approach, in order to ensure that China does not gain access to these technologies. So the agreement would constitute a framework for preferential treatment for partners like Bahrain that sign on to this agreement to be able to cooperate with the U.S. on such technologies.
Ms. Dent.
As an aspirational target.
I want to ask Ms. Dent, because she wanted to come in at this point. Please do.
I just wanted to highlight a couple of other areas in the tech and the economic spaces. So, for example, I mentioned earlier that a large part of this agreement was about accelerating pre-existing efforts. One of those efforts is the FAA and the Bahrain Civil Aviation Authority sitting down to discuss direct flights. So because of this agreement, the United States pushed the Federal Aviation Authority to get out to Bahrain sooner to help ensure that security measures were being matched and they could continue to pursue these direct flights. Beyond the technological initiative that was announced in December, which is a technological initiative that is complementary to military and security pillars, there are a number of different areas where the U.S. and Bahrain are also promoting cooperation on specific standards. So for cybersecurity, Bahrain has had multiple cybersecurity attacks. The United States is working with the Bahraini government on resiliency, and Bahrain also has some very unique privacy data laws that could help attract tech investments, both from the United States and the United Kingdom. So again, there's a lot of areas where there is potential for cooperation that may have not necessarily been announced yet, but I think that government officials are looking into at this time.
Thank you. Can you just say a little bit more about these privacy laws that may be particularly attractive to tech entrepreneurs?
Dr. Al-Hassan, you're probably the expert. Would you like to?
Okay, please.
So I'm not an expert on Bahraini data privacy laws, but I think by and large, there would most certainly be, I think, a broad government and legislative appetite in Bahrain to enact the necessary reforms to ensure the flow of investment in the technological domain in Bahrain. And this is a broad regional trend in the GCC. We've seen Saudi Arabia, the UAE, make a lot of regulatory changes and pour a lot of investments into this domain. And now, of course, Bahrain is a very different regulatory environment than Saudi Arabia or the UAE, but I think would probably share the broad ambition of being able to attract US and other investments into the Bahraini ecosystem in that regard.
I mean, what I'm hearing, and I may be completely wrong, is there may be an attraction to entrepreneurs, tech entrepreneurs, of a lesser degree of transparency in relation to regulatory arrangements or something like that. Am I getting that right?
So the 2018 Personal Data Protection Law is essentially additional legal protections for individuals, companies, and their data. So it's a big draw for the private sector. I don't necessarily think it's less transparent per se, but it is a draw because it's data protection, which is focused on the individual.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Right.
I just had one question to rewind to Lord Grimstone's first question, which was on the subject of the possible effect or not of this agreement on the pre-existing agreements on dealing with piracy and such like. And I think Dr. Roberts said he didn't think it would make much difference to that. And I just really wanted to check with Dr. Al-Hassan, not wishing to spread dissent between our witnesses, but whether from your perspective there is anything that this adds in order to the effective policing of the area, or whether that is as good as it's going to get anyway.
So I do think that the CCPA agreement is probably complementary to those efforts and could be seen as an additional layer of joint effort to counter piracy. I think it's important to recall that Bahrain over the past year has been the only Arab or Muslim majority state to formally support and participate in Operations Prosperity Guardian and Poseidon Archer. It has supported the combined maritime forces. It has supported the expansion of the combined maritime forces, has led multiple of these task forces under CMF including those that engage in interdiction, counter-piracy, counter-arms trafficking, efforts in the Gulf and the Red Sea, in the Gulf of Aden and the Arabian Sea as well. And so I don't think there is tension or contradiction between these pre-existing efforts, if anything, and CCPA. I think, if anything, CCPA probably reinforces those and provides yet another layer through which the US, Bahrain, and eventually the UK could further cooperate in that regard.
Thank you. I think Elizabeth
Dent wants to add something. Yes, please.
I just wanted to foot stomp Dr. Al-Hassan's words on that. So it is very complementary to initiatives that are already ongoing in the region to secure the waterways. And I do think that CCPA helped provide Bahrain the framework and the security assurances that it probably needed to feel comfortable being the only Arab or Muslim country that was publicly affiliated with either Operation Prosperity Guardian or Operation Poseidon Archer. I also want to go back to the initiative that Dr. Al-Hassan mentioned a few minutes ago, the Geospatial Acceleration Initiative. As I mentioned, it's a technology initiative under that pillar, but it helps support the critical shipping lanes defense because it helps them, again, share hydrographic, aeronautical, and topographic data sets with the Bahrainis, but it also facilitates greater access to commercial imagery, and it can help produce data sets where we're enhancing navigational safety for military forces and bolstering maritime security in the region. So again, all of this is complementary, and it's about pursuing things that maybe we otherwise would not have with these partners in the agreement.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I think I'm going to turn to Lord Marland now, please, to intervene at this point.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for letting me join you by Zoom. The agreement contains a commitment in the event of an external aggressor coming against one of the parties, and it states that all parties agree to develop a response. It'd be very interesting to hear an elaboration on that and what are the circumstances that might occur. You've referenced a few earlier in the meeting, and I'd be particularly concerned about what level of response it could be.
Who would like to start with that question, please? Dr. Roberts.
Thank you very much. So I think when it comes to the issue of what might prompt a level of concern, we need to go back to, Yes Minister and salami slicing and the likes, to be honest, because we've seen an awful lot of irregular tactics undertaken in the Gulf, from mines that appear on ships and missiles that get flung around. And so there are these irregular components, which Bahrain is one of several targets of this, of course. So it goes from that blurry greyness, of course, all the way up to something obvious and kinetic that are in people's minds. In terms of the next step, what does this agreement mean for the UK, for example? I think two sort of contrasting things. I think de jure, this probably, I don't know what existing defence cooperations agreement exists at the moment and what pre-existing commitments we already have to Bahrain's national security in the event of blah, blah, blah. That's one important caveat. But I sort of feel that, like I say, de jure, reading the text of it, it's a matter of grave concern with respect to constitutions and laws. Immediately the most senior levels will determine defence needs. It's quite open and loose to my interpretation. I'm not a lawyer, but it strikes me as, in a de jure sense, quite, like I say, open to interpretation, should we say.
Lacking in specificity.
Yeah, thank you, yes, thank you very much. But when it comes to the regional reaction, I think there will be more of a de facto expectation of significant help. The idea of, well, Britain and the US have been our core allies for so long. We have these rafts of agreements going back a very long time. There's enormous support in the military area. You have military bases in the region. Of course, HMG, of course. We have this new agreement just now. Of course you are going to aid in some way, shape or form. And so like I say, I'll offer that de jure and sort of de facto expectation, which I think would be at play with this and other similar agreements in the region.
I understand. Any of our other witnesses want to comment on that? Then let me just turn then. I'm sorry, I can't see again.
Oh, happy to.
Elizabeth Dent was.
I think it's both.
Both.
I'm going to have a more physical prompt for me to see when people put their hands up. Please, Ms. Dent.
Oh, okay. So I agree that I think the language is quite vague intentionally. I think that the key word is consult. It is an agreement to consult at the threat of an external aggression or an external aggression. So in other words, it's an agreement to meet immediately following this threat or something that occurs. That could mean anything depending on the size and scope of what the threat or the actual external aggression is. And I think, as we all know, there are a number of tools in the toolbox that countries can utilize to help satisfy this clause. I think it could mean anything from a very strongly worded joint statement to even potentially non-operational or operational support for retaliation, which of course would be something that each country would have to determine on their own to satisfy this agreement. But again, it is intentionally vague to allow for that flexibility.
Intentionally vague, but does talk about meeting at the most senior levels, talks about immediately sharing available and appropriate information and intelligence, all of which sounds perhaps lacking in specificity, but quite powerful stuff. Would you agree?
I would agree, but I think that if it were at the level of something like that would require a response, the head of states or defense ministers would already be in discussions anyway. And given that we are such close partners, the US and UK and Bahrain, we would likely be proactively wanting to share intelligence or information related to any sort of attack anyway. So it's not really signing us up to anything that we don't already do.
Okay. Dr. Al-Hassan, please.
Well, thank you very much. Again, with the caveat that I'm not a lawyer or an expert in law, I would say to me the operative language here is develop and implement appropriate defense and deterrent responses to external aggression or the threat of external aggression. Now, that being said, when the language is somewhat deliberately non-specific, not as explicit as, say, a NATO Article 5, where an attack against one is an attack against all, that leaves no room or very little room for interpretation. In the case of CSIPA, I think it's sufficiently vague. Ultimately, a security commitment is always in the eye of the beholder. But I would, in a sense, second Dr. Dent's view that, in a sense, the commitment is somewhat superfluous, in the sense that it doesn't really commit the US and arguably, I would say, the UK to something that would not have probably been done anyway. There is already a very significant degree of geostrategic alignment on the way the US, Bahrain, and the UK perceive threats in the Middle East. Their threat perception is very much aligned, and they have a long track record of responding and cooperating on such threats in the past.
And that's why I think from this committee's point of view, we have a bit of a challenge, because we're wanting to look to see what this is adding to existing commitments. And that's a little bit more difficult to identify, though we've had some important evidence already about the factual expectation that there will be.
Time is going on.
Lord Boateng, want to ask a question?
I'm just having a confab with Lord Hannay.
Right. I'm going to turn to Lord Anderson, please.
In commenting on the significance of the agreement, I think it was Dr. Al-Hassan who called it a framework agreement. Indeed, he used the term framework on several occasions. Framework for existing commitments, which puts the whole agreement in some perspective. Obviously, the UK eminently qualifies because of existing range of agreements with Bahrain, naval agreement, history, and so on. But are there any other countries, non-regional, which come nearly close to those links which the UK has, and which have made the UK obviously a candidate for membership?
So not for Bahrain. I think as far as Bahrain is concerned, there's the cooperation with the United States and with the UK in that order. I think is probably the most significant set of non-regional relations on defense and security that Bahrain has. Period. And so, in a sense, the US and the UK are the most likely candidates for such a relationship with Bahrain. But you touch on a very important point, which is the idea that this is a framework. And I agree with that characterization. As you've said, I've used it multiple times because I think it is a framework on the one hand that covers existing and, in a sense, formalizes existing defense and security cooperation. But I think it's important to keep in mind some of the growth potential of that framework in two respects. The first respect being membership. So this is still a bilateral agreement. It might become a trilateral agreement once the UK accedes to it, and then it could keep growing. Dr. Dent has touched on some of the potential regional members, and most of these would be US, Arab, and Gulf partners. There are non-regional partners that could potentially take an interest, but I think there are some obstacles there, and I'll mention why. So India would be an interesting one. India has joined multiple minilateral frameworks, cooperation frameworks with Israel, with the UAE and the United States. So I2U2 is what it's called. India has recently joined the Combined Maritime Forces stationed in Bahrain, and it's been seen as a likely partner, a force multiplier that the United States could work with alongside with the Arab Gulf states to share the collective security burden in the region. The issue, I think, on the Indian side is that India is not generally terribly excited about taking on enhanced or formalized security commitments. It has traditionally shied away from that in the Middle East. And I think India also has a strong relationship with Iran, and so might be wary of upsetting the Iranians on that front. I would say the other likely or potential candidates would be the French, because the French do have a military presence in the Gulf. They
French bilaterally or as part of the European Union?
Both. And so they bilaterally, in terms of their presence in the UAE, that's a bilateral arrangement with the UAE to station French forces there. But France is also part of multiple coalitions of the willing, multiple European coalitions of the willing. So there's the MSA, which is a European coalition, not an EU coalition, but a European coalition of a few European countries that patrol the Strait of Hormuz. And there's ASPIDES, which is another European coalition that is undertaking maritime security efforts in the Red Sea at the moment. But again, the French have been reluctant to sign on to US-led frameworks in the past. And so when the Americans surged in the Strait of Hormuz, the French spearheaded MSA separately, and the same goes for the Red Sea. So the French prefer to work with other European partners in parallel with US and UK efforts, but they prefer to do it independently, at least formally speaking, of US and UK efforts. So while France already has a presence in the region, because of this willingness to operate independently, I think that would be an obstacle to France's joining the agreement. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed. There are a couple of other points I would like us to deal with, slightly differently from the issues we've been touching on now. May I turn to Lord Hannay, please, to raise those?
Yes, I think we'll take these separately because they're quite different. The first question, it would be helpful to have some response from all of you, is to what extent do human rights problems in Bahrain and the tensions between its Sunni and Shia populations affect the security situation and the likelihood that this agreement might be rendered operative?
Who would like to start with that? Dr. Roberts?
Sure. I don't think there's an obvious link between internal domestic sectarian concerns within Bahrain and that impacting upon the execution of this kind of an agreement, if that's the question. I think the as I mentioned at the beginning, this fits into the general approach that we are taking, which is to engage extensively and consistently with our friends and partners in the Gulf, and this fits into that lineage, I think.
Well, could I just follow up that point, because I'm slightly puzzled by your response, because if there were trouble amongst the Shia community in Bahrain, and the government of Bahrain suggested, alleged, or claimed that it was being incited by Iran, then presumably there is a link to this agreement.
What I was trying to get to was the idea that as an internal sectarian, my understanding of the domestic Bahraini situation at the moment is that the chance of some kind of internal sectarian issue escalating to the point that it could impact on this or any other sort of agreement operationally, or whatever the language might be, I don't see that, if you see what I mean. Your angle that you raise about sort of potential, going back to the salami slicing aspects I was talking about earlier, about potential Iranian kind of inciting, it's a sensible kind of a point to raise. It's a potential concern, of course it is, but I don't see it as being particularly likely. I don't want to pretend that I am an expert on internal machinations within Bahrain, but I just don't see the situation as being that ripe for exploitation in that way, if you see what I mean.
Dr. Roberts, Lord Boateng wants to ask you a question.
Dr. Roberts, Bahrain is a long-standing friend and ally of the United Kingdom. We have very real security, trade and industrial, commercial interests which we share in that region. Iran is not a friend of the United Kingdom, and we are in competition with them. They have a track record of interfering in the internal affairs of nations. Do you still cling to the view that there is, quote, no proof whatsoever of Iranian interference to any significant degree in Bahrain's internal affairs? Or have you reserved the right, which indeed you referred to on previous occasions, of John Maynard Keynes to change your mind if new evidence presents itself? New evidence surely has presented itself since you expressed that opinion.
When was that exactly?
In The Guardian on the 20th of August 2011.
A little while back.
Quite so. That's why I ask you whether in the intervening period anything has occurred that has caused you, Keynes-like, to change your mind.
Dr. Roberts, can I just say this? I'm obviously very grateful for the question from Lord Boateng. If you need time to go back to that and consider it, I'd be happy to receive a written answer to that if you'd be willing to do so.
Very happy to offer a written response as well.
It does have a bearing on your response, which is why I raise it to Lord Hannay's question, because it would seem to the reasonably well-informed observer that Iran and Iranian agents may well be stirring things up internally in the domestic affairs of Bahrain.
I've no doubt of the relevance. I just wanted to be fair to Dr. Roberts. If he wants time to consider his answer, I'm happy that he's given that time.
Thank you very much. Just a quick thought then, if I may. So that was, of course, alluding to the Arab Spring, the Pearl Roundabout, all of those concerns. That is the immediate instigating elements that prompted that article to be written. In the subsequent years, I think that there's been a lot of reporting into it, the Bassouni report not being the most sort of important one. And I think, I'll be corrected by anybody, of course, but that report did conclude that an awful lot of the accusations of Iranian significant interference were not as substantiated in the final analysis as was often seen, as was seen at the time, as was argued at the time, as was argued by the government at the time that led to the Pearl Roundabout and all the grimness surrounding that. So that was my point there, that Iran is a malign influence in a variety of ways in the region. I don't think there's much of an argument about that. More recently, what we've seen a lot more is sort of, as I mentioned earlier, with maritime concerns. Mines and missiles are more in evidence in terms of the tactics that Iran is using. So one shouldn't rule out the idea that Iran might attempt to leverage support that it may or may not have within Bahrain. That's a reasonable concern to fret about, to think about. It absolutely is. But I don't see the logic that because something approaching a majority of Bahrain's population are Shia, that ergo they are some kind of fifth columnists, which I think was, especially at the beginning of the Arab Spring, some kind of a concern. So that's the sentiment I was trying to push back against.
Okay. Dr. Al-Hassan, you want to come in?
Yes, please. So I would say first of all, I think it's important to note that there's no clear connection between CCPA and human rights issue. There's no bearing on the issue one way or another. The second point I would make is that since Bahrain signed the CCPA in 2023, there has been, and I think this is purely correlation, not causation, major moves to ensure intercommunal harmony in Bahrain. And so I will mention one anecdotal and perhaps very significant example, which is the fact that over the past year, Bahrain has seen some of the largest prisoner amnesties in its history. 1,584 prisoners released in April, 457 in September, and 896 in December of this year. And so I think these go a very long way towards ensuring intercommunal harmony and more broadly, I think, social peace on the island. The third point I want to make, and I think this is very important, is that if we go back to the text of the CCPA agreement, it specifically mentions external aggression or the threat of external aggression. Now, the question of whether a hybrid Iranian threat on Bahrain that involves perhaps a combination of sub-threshold, gray zone warfare tactics, support for terrorism, is obviously conceivable. Let's remember that the UK government has designated 7 Bahrain-based groups as terrorist organizations. So has the US, so have a number of European countries. And I think Iran's broad track record in interfering in Yemen, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, Iraq, and many other places around the region, I think provides a lot of the kind of contextual background that one would need to understand the sort of behavior that Iran routinely participates in and undertakes. So I think the texts or the agreements mentioning of external aggression then means that the parties are able to determine for themselves whether the threat from terrorism or so on that Bahrain faces or could face down the line is externally instigated and would therefore warrant the kind of response that the CCPA agreement lays out.
And what the response should be.
Precisely.
Thank you very much. I've got one final question from Lord Hernay, because we're coming to an end of the session.
This is now turning to the overtly external aspect, which is Iran's territorial claim to Bahrain, which has been asserted from the time of the Shah onwards, and I believe is still the position of the Iranian government, although others, including successive British governments, consider it without merit. Could you just give us, all three of you perhaps, some feel for the relevance of that claim for this security agreement?
Shortly, please, I think, because of time.
Well, just to start, I think de jure it was, I'll be corrected, but I think it was given up in 1971 to do with the the 3 islands off the UAE that the Iranians took. When the Brits left, of course. I think it was sort of folded into that agreement, if I'm remembering rightly, or not the agreement, forgive me, but around that time that Iran formally gave it up. But it is still a subject of local right-wing newspapers, as it were, ginning up these things. So it's a motif, if you will, but I don't think it has any pragmatic implication today.
Does anyone want to add anything further to that? Dr.
Yes, please. So Bahrain is a sovereign, independent nation. It's a member of the UN Security Council, UN of the United Nations, of the Arab League, and many other multilateral organizations. CCPA or not, one would hope that if Iran were to attempt to reactivate its unfounded claim, which was dropped, as Dr. Roberts has mentioned, on Bahrain through military aggression or the threat thereof, that CCPA or not, countries like the US, the UK, and others would come to Bahrain's aid. I think it's important to keep in mind that Iran often weaponizes this claim as part of its hybrid warfare against Bahrain and other GCC and Arab states. And so in recent times, Iran has revived this claim through newspapers, through personalities and figures associated or closely associated with the Iranian Supreme Commander, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, in response to the Arab League or the GCC mentioning the disputed Emirati islands. So when the Arab League or the GCC lends support to the UAE's claims on the island, Iran will, as a matter of information warfare, disinformation, weaponize its claim, revive its claim through informal channels in order to rattle, pardon the expression, rattle the chains of the Arab states. But I think it doesn't go much farther than that. Iran formally recognizes Bahrain as well as a sovereign independent nation, has had diplomatic relations with Bahrain, and is now also reportedly seeking to reestablish diplomatic relations with Bahrain. So I think this is a theoretical risk. We shouldn't take this too seriously as a real claim. It's simply part of the information warfare tactics that Iran employs every now and again.
I think this is interesting context for us, but this committee is not going to extend to determining whether anyone else has any territorial claim to Bahrain. But look, this session time has come to an end. I want to thank all the members for their questions, but I particularly want to thank you, Dr. Al-Hassan, Dr. Roberts, and Dr. Dent, as I now understand. I should have addressed you, and I apologise for that. But thank you all very much indeed for your very, very informative evidence. This session is now going to come to an end. We've got another session coming, and I think technically we're suspending the session until that happens, but I want to thank you all very much indeed for your evidence.
Thank you.
We will be submitting, you'll see the transcript of the evidence that you've given, have an opportunity to correct anything that is wrong, but subject to that, we will write our report on the basis of the evidence we've received, including from you today. So thank you all so much. Session is now suspended.